So in many ways, the UN is effective, but I think often people look at the Security Council and think, oh, this is hopeless. I mean, look, at the moment, we have these raging conflicts in Tigray in northern Ethiopia. Right encircled by South Africa, you have these horrible events taking part in Eswatini, the former Swaziland. You have the military coup in Myanmar and protesters shot by the hundreds, tortured and so on. There is a long and tragic list. The UN is so polarized at the Security Council that almost nothing gets dealt with firmly.
Hi everyone, I'm Petrus and welcome to WorldView. WorldView is a podcast where we explore everyone's perspectives on all things that can broaden our worldview. If you've watched any of our content so far and liked it, please consider liking this video, subscribing and donating our Patreon. Today we're talking with the Right Honourable Helen Clark. Helen is a New Zealand politician who served as the 37th Prime Minister of New Zealand from 1999 to 2008 and was the Administrator of the United Nations Development Programme from 2009 to 2017. She was also New Zealand's 5th longest serving Prime Minister and the 2nd woman to hold that office. Helen, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
So we had the absolute privilege to talk to Lord Peter Hain a couple of months ago, which was a fascinating discussion. Of course, he comes from South Africa and has a very strong connotation in terms of our history there and the work that he's done. He mentioned that you were also an anti-apartheid activist, or rather you have a background of being anti-apartheid activist. Could you just fill us in about what that is and just your general upbringing?
So I grew up in rural New Zealand where rugby was the man's sport. But when I went to university, of course, and was exposed to a wider range of influences, one of the issues I got involved in was the anti-apartheid movement at the university. And in New Zealand, that very much focused on the rugby relationship with South Africa. To some extent, cricket, but really primarily rugby. And there had been a history going back to much earlier in the 20th century where New Zealand would send teams to South Africa that were white-only teams. Extraordinary, really. And then in the late 50s, a movement grew up which was called No Maori, No Tour, because Indigenous New Zealanders, Maori, were always a very significant part of the New Zealand rugby scene, right up to being All Blacks. These days it's also Pacifica players, but always Maori players have been very, very important. And so this movement obviously put the issue to New Zealanders. This isn't right. We can't see teams go off to New Zealand which leave the Maori players at home. That's not the sort of society we are. So, of course, that ran up against the apartheid system in South Africa. But interesting that the government in South Africa then said, well, of course, we want the All Blacks to come. So we will designate the Maori players as honorary whites. Well, that just further inflamed the anti-apartheid opinion in New Zealand. Oh, I'm absolutely serious. The Maori players went as, quote, honorary whites for the purpose of the tour. So in a sense, that galvanized the movement further to get broader support. And when I began university in 1968, there was a high level of awareness of the issues in South Africa, a high level of awareness that Nelson Mandela was languishing in a jail on Robben Island, which of course in later years I was able to go and visit as a tourist to see what he and his fellow prisoners went through. So then we began campaigning, of course, for the rupture of the rugby relationship altogether. And that pretty much divided urban and rural New Zealand, crudely speaking. Urban New Zealand more liberal, rural New Zealand, really having rugby almost as a religion. I went on the executive of the Halt All Racist Tours movement in 1970 at the university. So we campaigned against any teams going at all. I think the most dramatic moments in the anti-apartheid movement in New Zealand came in 1981. And in 1981, you had a Conservative Prime Minister called Mr. Muldoon. And Mr. Muldoon was struggling with that election. The previous election, my party, the Labour Party, had got more votes but fewer seats. He knew that he had to pull some trick out of the book to win this third election in a row. And what he did was persevere with a rugby team coming to New Zealand from South Africa, a racially selected team, even though he was warned that there would be very significant issues of citizen discontent and protests and demonstrations. I think his attitude was bring it on. And so what happened when the tour came was that the players, of course, had to play under great security. There were huge marches and demonstrations. There was the famous occasion, I think the second game of the match, where in the regional town of Hamilton, the protesters bought tickets and at a certain trigger point then invaded the field and wouldn't move, and the game had to be cancelled. Apparently the news of this got all the way to Robben Island, to Mandela's prison cell. So, New Zealand had its niche role, if you like, in support for the anti-apartheid movement and highlighting the issues. So when the government changed the following election, because the 81 election, which split New Zealand down the middle over this issue, when the government changed, then that kind of tour became a complete impossibility. The New Zealand relationship with the regime in South Africa was ruptured. The South African consul left New Zealand. The Prime Minister went on a tour of what were then called the frontline states of Zambia and Zimbabwe and so on, and said, look, this is a different New Zealand, and we want to stand with you for a free and democratic South Africa. And then, of course, the change eventually came. So that was my background with it, always very, very engaged in these issues. I guess really the first major human rights campaign I was involved in.
Yeah, I mean, there's I keep thinking about all of the connections we have in South Africa to New Zealand, especially along our cultural lines. I mean, we have both a history, of being British states, and there's a lot of inherent connection that we have with each other there. And not only, obviously one of our major languages, of official languages, but also of our people. I mean, a lot of South Africans have since moved to New Zealand. We are, absolute, as you mentioned, rugby is at the core of the relationship between South Africa and New Zealand. And I just never, ever knew what an impact that had on New Zealand and its politics specifically being such a deciding point. So that's fascinating to learn, because I think sometimes, especially in our history, we get focused in terms of what happened here, the battle that happened here. But I mean, that happened largely across the world as well, in terms of the awareness and the protests that happened along it, and the pressures that would apply to South Africa that eventually would also help to lead to the free South Africa we have today. So thank you. That's fascinating to learn about.
And in that respect, I think the important point is that it also caused New Zealanders to reflect on their own society. When the penny dropped that it just wasn't right to send all white teams, and then it wasn't right to send teams with Maori who were designated honorary whites so they could pass the test of South Africa, that caused a deeper reflection about our society and the relationships between Indigenous people and the people who look like me, who came centuries later as settlers, overwhelmingly from the United Kingdom. And those debates go on to this day, as I'm sure they do in South Africa itself, as we try to work out how we live alongside each other as peoples.
And in what parts, or would you mention that? Would you say that that was one of the highlights of your career in terms of that battle that happened there, and especially in 1999? Or what were other highlights in your political career? Was it driven by this movement, or were you more developed in South Africa? In New Zealand's situation in itself?
So, as a student, there were three big movements at the time. One was this. A second was the movement against nuclear weapons testing in the South Pacific. So I became involved as a young politician, also very much with the nuclear-free New Zealand movement, a nuclear-free South Pacific, a world free of nuclear weapons, sadly not achieved yet. And then the other big issue was, of course, New Zealand's involvement in the Vietnam War, which it had no place to be in at all. and New Zealand sent soldiers at the Americans' request. It's quite sobering to go to Ho Chi Minh City and go to the museum, which focuses on the foreign invaders, and there is New Zealand, for heaven's sake, listed as one of the countries that sent troops. Not New Zealand's finest hour, obviously. So those were all big movements for me as a young person. Now, for me, the highlight of my political career, of course, was being Prime Minister. But it's interesting how the issues come back around. And in 2001, obviously, there was the 9/11 incident, which was caused us to re-examine some of our foreign relations. But more significantly was the US invasion of Iraq. And I think there's always a bit of an expectation among the 5 Anglophone democracies, of which New Zealand is one, UK, US, Australia, Canada, that maybe they'll move as one. Well, actually, New Zealand had been carving out an independent foreign policy for decades. And so when it came to the issue of Iraq, and the pressures were obviously on for an invasion to take out Saddam Hussein, I took a very strong position as leader of my government that this was not something the New Zealand government could countenance. And I said, to young people, Iraq is, to your generation, what Vietnam was for mine. That we have no place intervening in these conflicts. New Zealand has to stand for something, bigger and different, and working within the international system to uphold human rights and good values. So that was quite a defining moment, really, to hold the line against any pressure to get involved in that.
Okay, that's fascinating to learn as well. I mean, that again is a part of history that we're not really taught much about in terms of the involvement of the different countries in the Vietnam War. And of course, I mean, going back, South Africa itself was involved usually in the Western wars back in, for example, the Second World War, where we had troops serving in North Africa. But after that point, it kind of, lost all interest and completely introspected. So the foreign policy in that case kind of just completely dismantled. But anyways, I want to talk also about your involvement with the United Nations. This is something that's quite interesting to me. And I first off want to address that there is a general opinion, especially among more right-wing political parties, that the UN is a largely ineffective body. Like that when something happens and the UN has the chance to stand against it, they make a declaration, but they don't do anything. What are the positive contributions that the UN have made that would counter this argument? Or do you agree that the UN actually, to a certain degree, does not take enough action?
The UN is many things. So one thing it is a reflection of the member states with its General Assembly and its Security Council. Very polarized Security Council again these days, not unlike the days of the Cold War between the United States and its Western friends and the Soviet Union. But then there's another UN, and that's the UN of the organizations. What do the peacekeepers do? What does the Department of Political Affairs do? What does the UN Development Programme, which I led for 8 years, do? What does UNICEF do with children? What does the Human Rights Commission of the UN do? And these organizations do a tremendous amount of good. If you think of the UN Human Rights Commission, it's absolutely independent. The Commissioner can't be told what to do by the Secretary General or by the member states. They have their own statutory power and authority, and they can speak very, very powerfully. At UNDP, we had relations with every kind of member state in the world, from the Western donors to the most authoritarian countries among developing countries. But our attitude always was, let's see what we can offer, even in the most difficult of circumstances, to try to make things better for people and the environment, and try to improve governance where we can. So in many ways, the UN is effective, but I think often people look at the Security Council and think, oh, this is hopeless. I mean, look, at the moment, we have these raging conflicts in Tigray in northern Ethiopia. Right encircled by South Africa, you have these horrible events taking part in Eswatini, the former Swaziland. You have the military coup in Myanmar and protesters shot by the hundreds, tortured and so on. There is a long and tragic list. the UN is so polarized at the Security Council that almost nothing gets dealt with firmly. Many years ago, there was an adoption by the UN General Assembly of the responsibility to protect, so that where a government turned on its own citizens, started killing them in cold blood, that the UN should use that as to look at what measures it could take. Unfortunately, now we find that these very recalcitrant states who kill their own citizens, they are protected by powerful patrons, and it's very hard to get any concerted action. The Secretary General, of course, can speak, but he doesn't have power unless he can take the Security Council with him. So that is the frustration. There's also the frustration for smaller countries, including my own, South Africa, that there's a permanent 5 on the Security Council. And that goes back to when the UN Charter was written in San Francisco in 1945. 5 countries were given permanent membership. Are they going to give it up? Not on your Nelly, as the saying goes. So they have a veto on everything. And that's why you can't deal decisively with issues from Tigray to Yemen to Myanmar to Syria to Eswatini to wherever.
Yeah, Myanmar really took a front seat in the world stage in terms of people that expected. I'm not exactly sure people knew what they expected. I don't know exactly what they wanted from the UN in terms of the peacekeeping force. If they wanted to go in there and then forcibly require the national police to stand down in terms of the actions they were taking, or just create a situation where the protesters could diplomatically discuss with the government. There was a very wide range in terms of what people expected from it. But the complete situation of almost want to say powerlessness that people recognized in terms of the Security Council. I think that might have been the thing that caught people's attention the most, in the sense that, some completely and utterly immediately condemned the actions by the government against the people of the state, against the people behind the state, and they're nothing. It's just like there's always the voice and then no action. And I think that's what might be the thing that takes people's confidence out of it. In terms of another situation, I know you were part of a investigation into how China handled the COVID-19 pandemic specifically, not necessarily the origin. And from that, we learned a lot of different things in terms of how the situation could have been handled better by pretty much every nation on earth. And I have to say, at least from a perspective of a South African here, it seems like New Zealand was this absolute haven. I mean, when I see some of the concerts that you've had in the recent months, and we're, not allowed to hug each other in public type of scenario, it's something where it kind of looks like this utopia that just we want to escape to, so we can just have a relationship with our fellow people in the future. In this case, what did you learn from how China handled it, and then in comparison to how New Zealand handled it, in terms of the fact that you now have a much more open society and communication with each other? How did that study compare with what you did?
So for most of the past year, I was really very preoccupied with co-chairing the Independent Panel for Pandemic Preparedness and Response, which was requested by the World Health Ministers meeting in May 2020, meeting at the World Health Assembly. And I think when they requested this independent, impartial and comprehensive review of the experience of responding to COVID, they probably thought the pandemic would be done and dusted by May this year when we reported. Of course, far from being done and dusted, it was accelerating, and it is still accelerating in 5 of the world's 6 regions. That's the tragic thing. We're nowhere out of the woods in this, as South Africa and much of Africa, sadly, is so aware. So what our panel found was that there were just so many missed opportunities to nip this in the bud. And yes, you can go back to the beginning in China. You can go to what happened in the hospital in Wuhan, and let's not blame the doctors there. They saw this cluster of pneumonia cases of unknown origin. They sent samples for tests, and within about 10 days of the observation and the tests being sent, the Wuhan authorities issued a bulletin drawing the attention of all hospitals in the region to the outbreak. But things didn't move so fast from there. Didn't move so fast in Beijing and didn't move fast in Wuhan. Wuhan did not lock down until after the Lunar New Year. It didn't lock down until the 23rd of January, which was a good 3 weeks after the notice first went out in the health system. So there's opportunities lost there. The WHO is not effectively empowered to do what needs to be done. It, for example, didn't get quick access to the sites. It's constrained by not being able to publish information without a member state's permission, so can't tell the full story. It is somewhat constrained by the international health regulations, wanting it to dot every I and cross every T before it issues a warning, whereas clearly when you have a respiratory pathogen capable of being breathed on people and spreading, there is a case for precautionary action. And then it's hemmed in by having to convene an emergency committee, which for reasons our panel really can't understand, did not, when convened on the 22nd and 23rd of January, agree to recommend the declaration of public health emergency of international concern. That didn't happen for another 8 days. So you've got a month of what we would say in New Zealand fluffing around, not enough action. But having said that, it still wasn't a pandemic at the time of the 30th of January. What then happened was the declaration goes out and most countries kind of sit and look at it and think, oh, that's interesting. And we're all looking at Wuhan on the TV. Most countries not dusting off plans, people traveling like they always did. And I think it wasn't really until it hit Italy with force, a major Western country, that's when panic set in New Zealand. That's when our government threw out the flu pandemic plan, which was inappropriate for this coronavirus, and moved in a sort of step sideways movement towards a zero tolerance policy for COVID. I mean, it was coming in on the planes. They said, enough. We're going into quarantine. We've got too much here now. It's transmitting in the community, and we're going to lock down. And we locked down really hard for 7 weeks. 7 weeks to kill off that first set of chains of community transmission. Most countries did not go hard and early like that. And that's really been the difference. Now, come back to China. Once China was seized of the need to lock down, it certainly did. And it has pretty much operated since then a zero tolerance policy. They see it, they stamp it out. That's the New Zealand approach, the Australian approach, Korean approach, Taiwan approach, Singapore approach, etc. In fact, in the Asia Pacific, generally, there are some quite good examples of that. But here's the rub, and this will affect South Africa as it affects many, many developing countries across regions, where you have many subsistence dwellers and not much social protection, if any, very little social safety net. You see the poor in these countries saying, I'm going to die of hunger before I die of COVID. And what we know is one of the lessons out of this is you'll never fight a pandemic like this if people can't stay home with support. The pandemic, for example, is raging in New Zealand's near neighbour Fiji at the moment, and they're not closing down because they say there's too many subsistence dwellers and they wouldn't be able to eat. But until the means are found to enable them to lock down effectively, in my opinion, they won't stop a rampant transmission. Look, Fiji, which has got a population of not much more than 1 million people, is having around 900 cases a day. I mean, this is incredible. In New Zealand, at the worst of it, we only had a fraction of that. So there's so many lessons learned out of this pandemic. And number one lesson, when the World Health Organization says this is a public health emergency of international concern, jump. Let's hope it doesn't work out to be like that, as other warnings like Ebola, Zika, SARS, swine flu didn't result in the worst. But you can't pick with perfect foresight what will result in the worst. So take every declaration like this seriously and put your plans into place. And if you can nip it in the bud early, then you won't face the really horrific situation we have now of a still accelerating pandemic.
I think that's probably the most important detail, and I think that's one of the major concerns across the international market in terms of how people reacted to certain regulations put in by their country. And in most scenarios, I definitely agree. Nipping it in the bud at the start is definitely the best way in terms of to approach it. It gets it, gets it sorted out. And New Zealand, even with hindsight, we know it could have done better. Even then, you guys all did a lot better than we did, for example. But the scenario there is that a lot of people don't like treating every scenario as the worst possible case scenario because it affects their livelihood incredibly negatively. I mean, it destroys businesses. It absolutely tears apart communities. And in that regard, a good social support program in terms of allowing life as normal to continue to exist is kind of the intricate detail there that you lit up. And I think that's important. It's important to realize that it both goes with, yes, restrictions, but also support. There has to be the carrot and the stick. Otherwise, that detail doesn't always work out. And in this regard, in terms of, I want to say the big discussion that's moved from COVID-19 to the moment is vaccines in terms of the distribution, the production thereof, the availability thereof. Our own President Cyril Ramaphosa said that he thinks that countries that are more well off, that are producing more vaccines than they necessarily need per capita, should be procuring these and transporting it to other countries which do not have the infrastructure to be able to distribute this. So the poorer countries, in terms of that support. How do you feel about that relationship between, obviously, I think that a country's primary concern is with its own citizens first and providing that they are safe, and then moving on to the world market as their resources are available. But how do you feel about that transition in terms of the expectations of poorer countries to say, okay, I need some help here, and then expecting that help?
Well, President Ramaphosa is absolutely right. And if his words aren't heeded, of course, the high-income countries can never be secure either, because as long as COVID is raging anywhere in the world, you have the prospect of more variants, and this Delta variant is causing a huge amount of concern now, and we will become like a dog chasing our tail. Yes, we've got vaccine against the core variant, but the core virus, but these variants are beginning to challenge that. So our panel looked at this in considerable detail. We know that the high-income countries with a total population of 1.16 billion people ordered in total over 4 billion doses. Okay, everyone needs 2 each. They have 2 billion spare doses. And our panel recommended that they make 1 billion of those available by September and another billion by mid-next year. Unfortunately, the G7 came in well under that. It only agreed to stump up about 870 million in the course of a year. Not enough. And what we know is the vaccines are there. Get them out there. So there's a distribution problem, or a redistribution challenge. Secondly, there's not enough manufacturing. Now, I see that South Africa has signed an agreement to be a manufacturing centre for these RMNA vaccines like Pfizer and Moderna. That's great. Hope it can happen fast. We need more centres of production of vaccine around the world. We need the companies to give countries the licenses, the voluntary licenses to do that and scale up production, because we're going to have to keep improving and manufacturing these vaccines for years to come. So we can't just do it off a few plants in the West and the Serum Institute in India. We need much more widespread production. Cyril Ramaphosa is also right in championing at the WTO the proposal for a TRIPS temporary waiver of treatments and vaccines connected with COVID. This, of course, isn't easy. While Joe Biden's administration has said the US is prepared to talk about it, the Europeans haven't been so helpful. But what we know is there's 2 practical things you can do: redistribute what the high-income countries aren't going to use, and secondly, expand production. If we could do that, we might have a chance of nipping the pandemic in the bud with the help of vaccines. Vaccines are not going to do the whole job, but they're a very important tool.
Yeah, I mean, I think I saw actually a video the other day, it was yesterday, about the vaccine production in southwestern India. It's the largest vaccine producer in the world, and they have recently upgraded, and I think recently as a year or 2 ago, they've upgraded to produce 1.5 billion doses per year. And we need, a lot more than that. Theoretically, we need 14 billion, world population times 2, of course. But, if the largest producer is producing 1.5 billion per year, what do you feel is the realistic ramp up time for countries? I know South Africa has a vaccine producing facility, I think in Port Elizabeth. But what's a realistic timeline in terms of getting production up? Because obviously everything's lagging behind, and while everything's lagging behind, people
lagging.
want to return. Sorry,
everything's lagging, and
right.
Dr. Tedros, in response to the call of our panel, has now elaborated what the strategy needs to be. He told the G7 in a year's time, when you meet in June, we need 70% of the world population vaccinated. Working back from there, we need 40% vaccinated by the end of this year. We need 10% of the global population vaccinated by September. Now, we can't do that on the current production. I mean, those figures you gave for India, if everyone's got to have 2 doses, that's not going to cover half the Indian population, is it? Right. So it's not enough. India will have other centres of manufacture. South Africa can gear up. I know Rwanda has put its name forward. Ethiopia has tried to get a pharmaceutical-related industry going in the past. There's talk of what could be done in Senegal. You need production more in Southeast Asia. You need production in Latin America as well. Now, what is standing in the way of it? The companies have to be prepared to license, because even if we could get the TRIPS waiver, if the companies are not prepared to share the intellectual property and the technology and the know-how that go with the production of these vaccines, we're not much further ahead. So really a lot of pressure needs to go back on Big Pharma and on the companies the countries where they're headquartered to get them to get voluntary licensing out. If you could do that, and you're taking it to somewhere where there is a reasonable skills base, as there will be in South Africa or in India, you could scale up manufacturing fairly fast, but you've got to take the first step, and that's let the licenses go out there and transfer the knowledge.
Yeah, okay, no, that's a very, very valid point. I mean, there's a lot of, I almost want to say copycat variants that are appearing in India and so on and so forth. And there's obviously a lot of people that are quite concerned with these. I mean, they say, it's based on the Pfizer one, it's based on the Moderna one, and people are like, no, you're not injecting me in something that I'm not sure is past clinical trials. So in that regard, getting the right thing licensed out is very, very important to deal with. I want to pivot over because we're nearing the end of the hour, and I know you've got another arrangement. I want to just quickly pivot over to the Helen Clark Foundation, which I know, of course, you're the patron of. And one of its main focus is the environment. So you've mentioned at the start of the interview that one of the things that you were championing at university in terms of the causes there was the environmental impact of nuclear testing in the Pacific, for example. We have a lot of other environmental issues that people are hopefully more aware of in today's case. What do you think is the threat that we face with climate change, and practically what can be done about it? Because it seems like almost everybody has a different practical approach to this.
The world currently is sleepwalking towards a 2.9 degrees Celsius global warming over pre-industrial levels. Now, the ambition of the Paris Agreement was to keep the global warming under 1.5. We're perilously close to that now. In the past, people used to talk about 2. Well, the closer to 1.5 you could keep it, the better. But we're heading for something well above that. And so there's huge threats to the world's food production from an erratic climate, which produces, on the one hand, far more extensive and protracted and severe droughts, and much more flooding, and the problems that come with that. The rising sea levels, the saltwater inundation, the crop production was once possible, very, very big issues. Much more frequent natural disasters. So, the severe landslides, the flooding, the droughts, which see so much forced displacement of people in dry lands. And then you have all the very particular heat issues. For example, these horrific heat waves that are going through the Northern Hemisphere now, like we haven't seen before, where that town in Canada just sort of self-combusted with the heat. You have older people dying of the heat in Canada in the years when it gets really intense. Heat waves in Finland, Siberia, the Nordic countries. Who's ever heard of this? And so the heat-induced stress, even short of death, is very, very serious. We're facing a world where there'll be more countries where it will be like the Gulf, where you just can't go out in the course of the day at all. It'll be too hot, too dangerous. You have the insects like mosquitoes able to thrive at higher altitudes. So you're starting to see the mosquito-borne illnesses, of which there are a number, and they're dangerous, going to higher altitude populations. And then you have, for the tick-borne diseases, like the deer tick, which produces Lyme disease in the northeast USA, there are now so many more days a year with ideal conditions for the breeding of ticks in the colder countries than there ever used to be. So the health threats are very, very significant. So, we need to take all this on board and urge our countries to do more. We all have to get out of coal, right? New Zealand has residual coal. We have to get out of coal. We finally set a date for it, 2030. I personally think it could be sooner. South Africa has to get out of coal. It has to move to clean, green, sustainable energy, as we all do. And investing in that for the long term will be a good investment. You have to look at a just transition because, of course, there are many jobs bound up with the coal mining and distribution and so on. But we face a pretty toxic world to leave to our children and grandchildren if we don't deal with this.
I mean, there's this, the cool thing is, or rather, I said the best part about this is that the sustainable technologies are becoming incredibly cool. Like people look at those technologies and think, "Damn, that's the future. That looks really exciting." They're very empowered by it, and they think like, okay, a house with solar panels on the roof. That's an attractive concept to people these days. So there's an additional social element which is helping accelerate these. But in terms of the research and making these economically practical, that's the part in which you say that the encouragement is really needed to be able to make this actually become widespread. It doesn't help if people think it's cool if they can't afford it, for example, as an example. I also want to add, there's also a component about some other, so definitely the climate change is highly accelerated by man-made technologies, but also we have some other practical issues, like, for example, the pollution of the ocean in terms of the amount of garbage patch and the fish netting, and also illegal dumping in certain sites. We see large reefs and otherwise absolutely beautiful undersea ecologies just completely being destroyed. Is that also something that your foundation addresses, or is it more specifically focused at the moment on climate change?
Well, we produced our very first paper on green hydrogen as a viable technology to bring in as you phased out coal and other things. But obviously oceans are something New Zealand's tremendously interested in, as is South Africa, because we are countries with large ocean borders, and our oceans are under terrible pressure. And it's not just plastics; it's the bottom trawling, the wrecking of the reefs, it's the pollution, it's the plastics. They say there's more plastics in the ocean than fish now. And then, of course, the warming of the ocean temperatures, which is, doing incredible damage to the Great Barrier Reef, one of the wonders of the world, but to coral reefs generally, with the bleaching from what's happening. So huge issues there. All these systems are interrelated in some way. Another crisis is the biodiversity crisis. There was a report out from the UN, I think, 2 years ago, which talked about 1 billion species going extinct, 1 million or 1 billion species, whatever, it's a huge number, going extinct in the next 10, 15 years. And in Southern Africa, you have your own particular challenges. I feel for the rhino, one of the most hunted animals on Earth, and its survival. And there's often a nexus between, organized crime, poverty, corruption, lack of rule of law, which sees wildlife trafficking, which is driving iconic species to their extinction. So there's many environmental crises. Desertification, another one, of course, also associated with what's happening with the climate. Just so many agendas to work on in the environmental sphere.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many problems that sometimes people feel, okay, the problem is too big to deal with. They just want to get away from it. They don't want to deal with it right now. But rather, the suggestion there is look at foundations like, for example, your Helen Clark Foundation, and also other organizations would look at a certain one of these, and then can focus on it and practically contribute to changing this. And that's what I'm assuming you're encouraging people to do, is look at the different ones that you're capable or interested in, especially in your immediate environment that you can make a change in, and then focus on those. We'll definitely make sure to provide the links for people down below to follow up on that. I know you've got another regimen, so I just want to give you a last opportunity to add anything you might want to say.
Well, one point I would note is my foundation has picked up on the issues of drug law and policy reform. And I have, for the past year, been chairing the Global Commission on Drug Policy, which is an organisation of former heads of state and government and some other eminent personalities who believe that prohibition has become the problem. That prohibition drives organised crime and trafficking and basically the misery that comes with over-incarceration and maltreatment of human beings who use drugs, who could be, your sister or brother, your child, your mother, your neighbour. So we campaign for the responsible regulation of drugs and an end to the criminalisation of the use of drugs. So that's a big campaign because it means taking on the United Nations conventions, which are the worst conventions that's ever produced, the ones on drugs. We often look to the conventions to be a gold standard of what should be done. This is a huge exception to that rule, because the conventions mandate the war on drugs launched by Richard Nixon as president half a century ago. And since then, none of the objectives set of substantially reducing or eliminating the supply and production of drugs has ever been met, and they won't be. Why won't they be? Because down through history, human beings have resorted to some psychotropic substance to take them out of themselves. And, many of them are part of the culture of a country, whether it's chewing khat or smoking cannabis in a religious ceremony or whatever. But we have a very odd history on the attitude to drugs with these conventions. Tobacco, arguably the most dangerous of them all and responsible for the deaths of about half the people who use it, goes completely unnoticed by these conventions. And yet other drugs like cannabis, which cause a fraction of the harm, are classed as Class A drugs with the heaviest rule book thrown at them. So in our commission, we argue for rationality, for evidence-based approaches, and for health and human rights-based approaches to those who use drugs.
Sorry, just a last question. Do you have another gold standard you're currently looking at if the United Nations aren't it anymore, or are you actually creating these from scratch in terms of what does the science show, what's being created? Or is there another country that might be doing it right so far?
Oh, yeah, no, there are countries doing it right. Canada, for example, a couple of years ago, legalized cannabis, put in a market regime around it. Uruguay has legalized. Quite a number of the states in the United States of America have legalized, which is kind of interesting because it's been the US that's driven the war on drugs. We're seeing movement now with the Biden administration to more of a harm reduction approach rather than a repressive approach. We see in quite a number of places in Western Europe and also Canada and Australia the big and important harm reduction initiatives like safe consumption spaces. So there's quite a lot of good and interesting practice out there for countries to borrow. One of the initiatives the Global Commission has taken is to support the formation of a specific Eastern and Southern African drugs commission with eminent personalities from the region, including a former deputy prime minister, a deputy president of South Africa. So there is interest in your region in getting this right, and we're very supportive of that.
Okay, well, thank you so much. It was very interesting. I'm glad you brought that up. I wasn't sure if we had the time. So thank you so much to you, of course, Helen, for joining us today and giving your worldview to us, your perspective. I just want to say to our viewers who've made it thus far, if you've made it thus far and you believe in terms of the details that Helen's put out here today and you want to share that message, please by all means share it. It doesn't only help to reach more perspectives across the world, but of course helps us as a YouTube channel as well. So thank you so much for watching. This has been WorldView.